In the Vietnam War, the jungle was never neutral. The NVA and Viet Cong used it perfectly. They watched, they waited, and when the moment was right, they struck, hard, fast, from every direction at once. This documentary covers 5 of the deadliest ambushes of the entire war: LZ Albany, Operation Hump, Operation Swift, Operation Allen Brook, and the Battle of Ia Drang. 5 battles nobody in the history books bothered to remember. 5 times American soldiers walked into something they never saw coming. 5 times they refused to quit. Subscribe and hit like before we start, and drop a comment below. Which of these 5 battles have you heard of? This channel covers the forgotten battles of the Vietnam War every week. Let's go. 4 trucks. That's all it took to bring them home. When the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry left for combat, they needed dozens of helicopters, 375 men fully equipped, a complete fighting force. 72 hours later, they came back in 4 trucks. November 17, 1965. 155 men died in a single day, the deadliest 24 hours of the entire Vietnam War. Hollywood made a movie about this battle, but they left this part out. This is the story they didn't want you to know. This is Landing Zone Albany. Before we begin, if you want more untold military history like this, hit subscribe. You won't regret it. To understand what happened at Albany, you need to know about the battle that came before it. 4 days earlier, on November 14, Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore led his battalion into Landing Zone X-Ray. It was America's first major battle against North Vietnamese regulars. Moore's men fought surrounded for 3 days against 3 enemy regiments. They held the line. They won. If you've seen the movie We Were Soldiers, you know the story. Mel Gibson, heroic last stand, American victory. But what the movie doesn't show you is what happened next. On November 17, 2 fresh battalions arrived to relieve Moore's exhausted men. One of them, the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, was ordered to march north to Landing Zone Albany. Just 2.5 miles away, helicopters would pick them up there. Simple, right? A walk in the sun. At 9 a.m., Lieutenant Colonel Robert McDade led his men out of X-Ray. They'd spent the night on the perimeter. No sleep, no rest, just waiting. Now they were marching through chest-high elephant grass in full combat gear, 80 to 100 pounds each. The heat was crushing. Years later, McDade would admit he had no idea what to expect. His orders were vague. Establish a landing zone at a place called Albany. Near the front of the column, Lieutenant Pat Payne spotted a North Vietnamese soldier sleeping behind a termite hill. Payne captured him. His sergeant captured a second. A third escaped into the jungle. Think about that. An enemy soldier gets away. You're deep in hostile territory, and an enemy fighter just ran off into the trees. McDade ordered the entire battalion to halt while he personally interrogated the prisoners. The men dropped where they stood, too tired to establish defensive positions. The battalion was now stretched over 550 yards. That's more than 5 football fields. A long snake of exhausted soldiers sitting in tall grass. McDade called all his company commanders forward. Every single one. They walked to the head of the column with their radio operators. Most of the battalion's leadership and communications equipment was now concentrated in one spot. The rest of the men? Leaderless, waiting in the grass. What McDade didn't know, what none of them knew, was that less than a kilometer away, 2 fresh North Vietnamese battalions were resting. The 8th Battalion, 66th Regiment, the 1st Battalion, 33rd Regiment. 800 men, well armed, looking for Americans to kill. And that escaped prisoner? He ran straight to them. At 1:15 p.m., McDade walked into a cluster of trees in the Albany clearing. He was briefing his company commanders. 5 minutes later, mortar rounds started falling. Then came the attack. Hundreds of North Vietnamese soldiers came running through the American positions. An L-shaped ambush, perfectly executed. The Americans were caught completely exposed. Men dove into the elephant grass, but in grass 3 to 5 feet high, you can't see anything. You can't tell friend from enemy at more than a few feet. The North Vietnamese ran down the length of the American column, firing as they went. Within minutes, the battalion shattered into dozens of isolated groups, each one fighting alone, surrounded. Captain George Forrest, commanding Alpha Company at the rear, heard the gunfire and immediately understood. His radio operators were shot dead beside him as he sprinted back to his men. He screamed at them to circle the wagons, form a perimeter, now. That split-second decision probably saved every man in his company. The rest of the battalion wasn't so lucky. The fighting turned into hand-to-hand combat, soldiers shooting at shapes in the grass. North Vietnamese troops climbed into trees to shoot down at the Americans. Some Americans were killing their own men by accident, unable to identify targets in the chaos. Artillery couldn't help. Air support couldn't help. The enemy was too close. Any bombs or shells would kill as many Americans as North Vietnamese. McDade was pinned in the trees with no idea what was happening to his battalion. Radios were going dead. Leaders were being killed. Radio operators were being killed. First Lieutenant James Lawrence was shot in the back of the head. 2 bullets straight through his helmet. Somehow they missed his brain, but the impact The battle raged through the afternoon. Small groups of Americans held out wherever they could. Some formed tiny perimeters. Others hid in the grass, waiting for help. By evening, reinforcements started arriving. The battalion headquarters expanded its perimeter. Wounded soldiers who'd been hiding crawled toward safety. Then came the medevac helicopters, except they couldn't land. The landing zone was too hot, too much enemy fire. The pilots refused. Major Frank Henry made a desperate call to the 229th Assault Helicopter Company, the Huey Slicks. When those pilots heard the request, every single one of them volunteered. At 9:46 p.m., 4 helicopters dropped into that hell and started pulling out the wounded. They made trip after trip through the darkness, through the fire, until every man who could be saved was saved. All night the fighting continued. Air Force bombers dropped napalm around the American perimeter. Men lay in the darkness, listening to the moans of wounded soldiers they couldn't reach. Some of those wounded were in enemy-controlled areas. There was nothing anyone could do. When dawn broke on November 18, the North Vietnamese were gone, vanished into the jungle during the night. The Americans fired what they called a mad minute, every weapon shooting at suspected enemy positions to make sure the area was clear. Silence. Then they started counting. 155 dead, 121 wounded, 4 missing. Out of 375 men, more than 70% were casualties. The survivors stayed on that ground for 3 more days, securing the area, evacuating the dead and wounded. On November 20th, they were finally airlifted out. When they returned to An Kee Base Camp, the division band was waiting for them, playing Gary Owen, the 7th Cavalry's marching song, the same song Custer's men sang at the Little Bighorn. What remained of the battalion fit into 4 2.5-ton trucks, 4 trucks, for 375 men. In 2002, Hollywood made We Were Soldiers, the story of Ia Drang, Mel Gibson as Hal Moore. 3 days of heroic combat at Landing Zone X-Ray. The movie ends with Moore's men being airlifted out, victorious, triumphant music playing. Landing Zone Albany is never mentioned, not once. The deadliest day of the Vietnam War was completely left out. Why? Because Albany doesn't fit the hero narrative. It's messy, it's complicated, it's about mistakes and chaos and young men dying because someone made bad decisions. But those men deserve to be remembered. James Lawrence survived. He recovered from his injuries. For the rest of his life, he's told the story of LZ Albany to anyone who will listen. He always ends the same way. When people go to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall, they see 58,000 names. When I go to the wall, I see Don Cornett's name 58,000 times. Every name on that wall represents someone's best friend, someone's son, someone's brother, someone's father. Landing Zone Albany wasn't a heroic last stand. It was exhaustion, bad decisions, and good men dying in the grass. But that's war. That's the real story. Not Hollywood endings. Not triumphant music. Just men doing their best in impossible circumstances. And sometimes, their best isn't enough. November 17th, 1965. 155 men, 16 hours. Remember their names. If this story meant something to you, subscribe for more untold military history. Leave a comment with your thoughts. Thanks for watching. It started like any other patrol. The sun rose slowly over the jungle, casting long shadows through the trees. The soldiers of the 173rd Airborne walked in silence. They had done missions like this before. Drop in, search the area, get out. But this time something felt different. The air was still, too still. Birds didn't sing, leaves didn't move. The jungle wasn't alive, it was waiting, watching. Then it happened. Gunfire ripped through the silence. Men screamed. The ground exploded. Bullets came from every direction. The trees weren't just trees anymore. They were hiding places for the enemy. The paratroopers were surrounded. Young soldiers, barely out of high school, were thrown into a nightmare. Some fought back, some prayed. Others rushed to save their friends, dragging them through the dirt, holding their wounds closed with bare hands. And in the middle of it all was one man, wounded but still moving, still saving lives. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He became a legend. This was no ordinary fight. This was not just another mission. This was Operation Hump, a brutal ambush deep in the jungles of Vietnam. A day that would change lives forever. A day that tested the courage of every man who walked that ridge. If you want to hear more real stories like this, stories of forgotten battles, brave soldiers, and history that still matters, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. There's so much more to uncover, and we're just getting started. In 1965, Vietnam was heating up. The United States had just sent thousands of troops across the ocean. Young men from all over America, farmers, factory workers, college dropouts, now wore the same uniform. Most had never left their hometowns. Now they were landing in a place they couldn't even spell a year earlier. Among the first to arrive was the 173rd Airborne Brigade. They were proud, elite, trained to drop into battle from the sky. The Army called them the Sky Soldiers. They came to Vietnam believing they could win, believing they were stronger, better trained, and better equipped than any enemy they might face. But Vietnam wasn't what they expected. The heat was unbearable. The jungle was thick, wet, and full of insects. The trees were so tall and close together that daylight barely reached the ground. Every step felt like walking into a trap. Still, the mission came down. The 173rd would take part in a search and destroy operation deep in a region called War Zone D, just north of Saigon. The area was believed to hold Viet Cong fighters, but no one knew how many. It was called Operation Hump. The goal was to push further into enemy territory, cross the hill, get over the hump, as the general said, and break the enemy's control in that region. The soldiers loaded into helicopters, their faces serious, their packs heavy. They were dropped into small clearings in the middle of nowhere. Tall grass and thick trees surrounded them. Once the choppers flew off, all they had was each other. For 2 days they moved through the jungle. It was quiet, too quiet. They saw signs of the enemy. Footprints, empty camps, cooking fires still warm. But no people, no gunfire, no voices. It was like ghosts had just passed through. Some of the men joked to break the silence. Others felt the knot tightening in their stomachs. They knew something was wrong. Still, orders were orders. They kept moving. On the morning of November 8th, the 1st Battalion was told to climb a small ridge near a place called Hill 65. They didn't know it yet, but the ridge was a trap. Viet Cong fighters had spent days preparing for this moment, digging bunkers, hiding weapons, waiting for the right time. That time had come. The men of the 173rd were walking straight into a nightmare, and there was no turning back. The jungle was thick with silence as Alpha Company made its way up the ridge. It was early morning, November 8th. The soldiers of the 173rd Airborne were tired, sweating, and on edge. The climb was steep, the undergrowth heavy. Vines grabbed at their boots. Leeches clung to their skin. Their shirts were soaked through. Each man watched the trees, waiting for something, anything to move. They didn't know it, but they were being watched. All around them in hidden bunkers and spider holes, the Viet Cong 271st Regiment waited. These weren't just farmers with rifles. They were well-trained guerrilla fighters who had spent weeks preparing for this exact moment. They knew the terrain, they knew the patterns, and they knew exactly where the Americans would walk. Alpha Company was walking straight into a trap. At first, nothing. Just the sound of boots in wet grass, the buzz of insects, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Some of the soldiers were beginning to relax. Others stayed quiet, rifles ready. Then, a single shot cracked from the tree line. Then a burst. Then all hell broke loose. Machine guns opened up from the front, left, and right. Mortars began dropping behind them, cutting off the path they had come from. The ridge became a storm of bullets, explosions, smoke, and screams. It was an L-shaped ambush, a deadly setup where the enemy traps a unit in a narrow zone and hits them from multiple sides. There was no cover, no easy way out. The trees exploded with gunfire. Men were hit and went down where they stood. Some soldiers dove for the ground, firing blindly into the green wall in front of them. Others couldn't even see where the enemy was. The Viet Cong were invisible, buried, camouflaged, and deadly. Commanders tried to regroup, but radios were jammed with noise. Orders were shouted over gunfire. Squad leaders were shot. Medics crawled from man to man, dragging the wounded behind logs or into craters. The fighting was close, sometimes no more than 5 or 10 feet between the enemy and the Americans. It wasn't like the movies. It was fast, brutal, up close. One soldier later said, "You didn't fight to win. You fought to stay alive one more minute." The enemy used everything: grenades, mortars, automatic rifles. Some soldiers fought back until their ammo ran out. Then they picked up rifles from fallen friends and kept going. Alpha Company was surrounded. Some groups were completely cut off, alone in the trees, hearing nothing but the sounds of battle and not knowing who was alive. The enemy was trying to break them down piece by piece. And then the enemy started getting closer. They began moving through the jungle toward the wounded. American soldiers who couldn't move lay still and listened to footsteps crunching leaves nearby. Some pretended to be dead. Others raised their rifles and waited until the last second. In the middle of all this, a young medic named Lawrence Joel crawled through the gunfire. We'll tell his full story in the next chapter. But even now, as bullets zipped past and grenades exploded around him, Joel kept going, patching wounds, dragging men to safety, giving hope where there wasn't any. As the hours passed, the situation grew worse. Some soldiers were down to their last magazine. Blood soaked the ground. The heat and smoke made it hard to breathe. Still, they held. Some men from Bravo and Charlie companies tried to reach them. They had heard the gunfire and knew something was wrong. But when they moved up the hill, they were ambushed too. The enemy had prepared secondary traps. Another wall of gunfire pinned them down. More men fell, but they kept moving forward. They knew their brothers were dying up there. It wasn't just courage, it was duty. They would not leave each other behind. At last, after hours of hell, the radio finally broke through. Artillery was called in. Coordinates were shouted over static. Within minutes, the jungle began to shake as American shells screamed in from miles away. The trees exploded. Bunkers collapsed. The Viet Cong finally began to pull back, but not in panic. They had done what they came to do. American planes roared overhead. Jets dropped napalm, tearing into the jungle canopy. Helicopter gunships fired down into suspected enemy positions. Smoke covered the ridge. The screams quieted. The battle began to slow. By evening, the worst of the ambush was over. The survivors gathered the wounded. They moved carefully, checking every shadow, every tree, every hole in the ground. The enemy was gone, but they had left behind something far worse than fear. The ground was covered in blood. Helmets lay empty, rifles broken, trees shattered. They had made it through the ambush, but not all of them. Some men cried, others just stared into the distance. Shock, exhaustion, silence. The jungle had swallowed many of their friends, and it would never give them back. One soldier walked the ridge and said quietly, "This place, it's never going to leave me." In the middle of all the chaos, bullets, explosions, screaming, one man kept moving forward. Specialist 5 Lawrence Joel wasn't carrying a rifle. He wasn't a squad leader or a machine gunner. He was a medic. His job was to save lives. But that day on that ridge, he became something much more. When the ambush hit, Joel was right in the middle of Alpha Company. Soldiers were dropping all around him. The jungle exploded. Men cried out for help. Blood soaked the ground. And instead of hiding, Joel ran toward the screams. He didn't think about cover. He didn't wait for orders. He crawled to the first wounded man and began treating him under heavy fire. Then he moved to the next, then another. Bullets snapped past his head. Trees splintered. Mortars hit nearby, shaking the earth. Then Joel was hit. A bullet tore through his leg. He fell hard, but he didn't stop. He tied a bandage around his own leg, grabbed his bag, and kept going, dragging himself forward with one leg, still treating the wounded. He was shot again, this time in the thigh. More pain, more blood. But still, he refused to stop. At one point, a sergeant ordered. Joel looked up and said simply, "I've got to get to my men." He would go on to treat over a dozen soldiers during the battle. Many of them likely would have died without him. He gave them morphine. He wrapped their wounds. He talked to them. He kept them calm. He gave them hope when everything else was falling apart. When the shooting finally stopped and the smoke cleared, Joel was still there, exhausted, bleeding, but alive. For what he did on that ridge, Lawrence Joel was awarded the Medal of Honor. He became the first Black American to receive the medal while still alive since the Spanish-American War. But if you had asked him, he would have said he was just doing his job. As the sun began to dip behind the trees, the ridge was still shaking with gunfire. The soldiers of Alpha Company were barely holding on. They were scattered, pinned down, low on ammo, and surrounded. Some had been fighting for hours without rest. Others had not even had time to think, only react. They weren't alone anymore. Soldiers from Bravo and Charlie companies had moved in from the south, trying to reach them. But the Viet Cong had planned for that too. New ambushes were set along the trails. Reinforcements walked straight into more gunfire, more traps, more explosions. But they didn't stop. They knew their brothers needed them. In some parts of the jungle, fighting was happening just feet apart. American soldiers and Viet Cong were on opposite sides of the same tree. Grenades were thrown over logs. Smoke and dirt clouded the air. Shouts of "Medic!" echoed through the trees. Wounded men refused to leave the fight. Some crawled to new positions and kept shooting. Others stayed with the injured, using their bodies as shields. Every man on that ridge had a choice: run, freeze, or fight, and almost all of them fought. By late afternoon, American commanders finally broke through the radio chaos. They called in artillery strikes from nearby fire bases. The explosions came fast, shaking the ground and ripping apart the jungle. Then came the planes. American jets and helicopters flying low, dropping bombs and firing into the treetops. The firepower was massive. Trees were blown apart. Bunkers collapsed. The sky was dark with smoke. The sound was deafening. But even with all of it, the enemy held for a while longer. They were dug in deep, and they knew the land. They had been fighting like this for years. Finally, as night fell, the gunfire began to slow. One by one, the enemy slipped away into the shadows. They carried their wounded. They left behind only shell casings and blood. The Americans didn't cheer. There was no victory in their eyes, only exhaustion, relief, and sorrow. They had survived the ambush, but they all knew they wouldn't be the same after that day. When the shooting stopped, the jungle went quiet again. It wasn't the kind of quiet that brings peace. It was heavy, full of smoke, blood, and sorrow. The smell of gunpowder hung in the air. Trees stood shattered. The ground was torn open. Leaves were black with ash. The survivors of the 173rd Airborne looked around and took in what had just happened. Bodies lay scattered across the ridge. Some were their friends. Others were men they had only met days before. Helmets lay in the dirt. Rifles sat where they were dropped. Bandages stained with blood marked the paths where medics had worked. Some soldiers sat in silence, staring at the ground. Others cried quietly, too tired to hold it in. A few walked slowly between the fallen, checking for signs of life, still hoping someone might move, or breathe, or open their eyes. The medics did what they could. They kept working, even when their hands were shaking. Wounded men were lifted onto stretchers and carried to helicopters. Others were comforted with whatever words could be found. No one was the same. The battle was over, but the cost could be seen in every face, every limp, every quiet stare into the trees. The ridge they had fought for was just a hill, but to those men, it had become a place of pain and memory. Commanders said the mission was a success. They said the enemy had been pushed back, that the Americans had stood their ground. But the soldiers didn't think about success. They thought about the friends they had lost, about how quickly everything had changed. Some of them had never fired a shot in combat before that day. Now they had seen what real war looked like, up close and personal. And even after the helicopters took them off that ridge, a part of them stayed behind. They would never forget the sounds, the smells, the look in a wounded man's eyes, the way the jungle swallowed everything when the sun went down. Operation Hump was over, but for the men who were there, the battle would stay with them for the rest of their lives. What happened on that ridge in Vietnam wasn't just another battle. For the men of the 173rd Airborne, Operation Hump became a moment that changed everything. It tested their strength, their loyalty, and their will to survive. It showed the world what young soldiers could do when they refused to give up, even when the odds were against them. It also showed how brutal and unforgiving the Vietnam War could be. Many who fought there came home with scars, some on the outside, many on the inside. The memories stayed with them, the faces of the friends they lost, the sound of gunfire in the trees, the feeling of crawling through mud to save someone, or being saved by someone else. But out of the horror came stories of real courage. Like the story of Lawrence Joel, the medic who wouldn't stop. His bravery inspired others, and his actions saved lives. He became the first Black American to receive the Medal of Honor during the Vietnam War, and one of the most respected heroes of his generation. The story of Operation Hump reminds us that history is not just dates and numbers. It's about people, young men thrown into impossible situations, who stood their ground, who fought for each other, and who paid a heavy price for it. Even today, decades later, the veterans who survived still remember. And those who didn't make it home are honored not just by medals or books, but by the stories we tell. Because as long as we remember them, they're never truly gone. Thank you for watching this story about Operation Hump and the brave soldiers of the 173rd Airborne. If this moved you, if it made you think, or if you learned something new, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. We share powerful, true stories from history that deserve to be remembered. There are many more battles, forgotten heroes, and moments of courage we'll be covering. Until next time, take care and remember, behind every war story are real people who lived it. It began as a quiet morning in the Kyu Son Valley, one of those rare moments in Vietnam when the jungle felt still, almost peaceful. But within minutes, that silence was shattered by the kind of gunfire that makes your heart stop. A single Marine company, isolated, surrounded, cut off by an enemy force that outnumbered them 5-1. Men shouted for ammo. Corpsmen crawled through bullets to reach the wounded. Radio operators screamed into their handsets for help that might not arrive in time. And deep inside that chaos, those Marines realized a terrifying truth. They weren't fighting to win. They were fighting to survive the next 5 minutes. What was supposed to be a routine patrol turned into one of the most desperate, blood-soaked battles the Marines faced in all of Vietnam. 11 days of relentless combat, 11 days of ambushes, last stands, heroism, and sacrifice. 11 days that would carve Operation Swift into Marine Corps history forever. And today, we're going back into that valley. But before we dive into this story, a quick message to all of you legends watching. More than 90% of you aren't subscribed yet, and we are pushing hard toward our next big milestone, 20,000 subscribers. So if you love deep story-driven military history, make sure to drop a like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments which forgotten Vietnam battle you want me to cover next. All right, brace yourself, because Operation Swift doesn't start with a battle. It starts with a nightmare. By the late summer of 1967, central Vietnam had become a pressure cooker. The war was shifting, growing sharper, heavier, and far more coordinated on the enemy's side. And at the center of that shifting battlefield lay one of the most dangerous pieces of ground in the entire Vo Corps region, the Cu Sun Valley. To the North Vietnamese army, the valley was more than a stretch of farmland and scattered villages. It was a lifeline, a natural corridor that linked their mountain bases to the coastal lowlands, a place where troops could move, regroup, resupply, and disappear back into the jungle before American patrols ever knew they were there. For the Marines of the 1st Marine Division, however, the valley represented something entirely different, a promise and a threat. The promise was simple. If they could secure the valley, they could disrupt NVA activity for miles. They could protect nearby villages, cut supply routes, and force the enemy into the open. But the threat was that the enemy wanted this ground just as badly, and they were willing to bleed for it. Throughout 1967, intelligence reports painted a grim picture. Entire battalions of the NVA 2nd Division were believed to be operating in the area. Hidden bunker networks, trenches carved into the hillsides, patrols disappearing without a trace. At night, villagers whispered of movement in the tree lines, long columns of soldiers slipping silently through the dark. The Marines could feel it too. The tension, the buildup, the unmistakable sense that something big was coming. By late August, American commanders had no doubt. The NVA was preparing for a major strike, aiming to uproot Marine positions and seize control of the valley once and for all. So the Marines responded the only way Marines know how. They prepared to hit first. Small unit patrols were ordered deeper into enemy territory. Observation posts watched the ridge lines for signs of mass troop movement. Artillery batteries stayed on high alert, and every Marine, whether he admitted it or not, felt the weight of what was brewing in the jungle. None of them, however, could have predicted what would unfold in the first days of September, how a single Marine company would step into the valley and disappear into an ambush so violent that it would drag the entire region into one of the bloodiest fights of the war. And that is where our story truly begins. In the days leading up to September 4th, the Cu Sun Valley felt wrong. Experienced Marines, men who had survived countless patrols, ambushes, and nighttime mortar attacks, began noticing signs that were impossible to ignore. Villagers who normally greeted patrols stayed inside their homes. Trails that were usually busy with farmers suddenly fell silent. Even the jungle itself seemed to hold its breath. Something was moving out there. Reports from reconnaissance teams hinted at unusual activity. Freshly dug fighting positions on the hillsides, footprints from large groups traveling at night, and the eerie discovery of abandoned camps that looked recently evacuated, as if the enemy had melted into the trees just moments before the Marines arrived. At night, the valley came alive with distant sounds, rifle bolts, quiet footsteps, whispers carried on the wind. The Marines of D Company, 1st Battalion, 5th Marines talked about it among themselves. No one liked to say it out loud, but they could feel it in their gut. The enemy was gathering, and not just a squad or a platoon. This felt bigger, more organized, more deliberate. Commanders sensed it too. Intel officers circled areas on the maps, pointing out where NVA forces might be massing. Patrol leaders were warned to stay sharp. The enemy was planning something. Yet even with that knowledge, the valley's dangers were unpredictable. One moment the jungle was quiet, the next it exploded with gunfire. That was the Cu Sun Valley, a place where entire enemy battalions could move through dense brush and remain invisible until they decided to strike. So on the morning of September 4th, when D Company received orders for a routine sweep through the southern pocket of the valley, nobody thought it would ignite one of the deadliest engagements of the year. To the Marines, it was just another patrol. Another hot day under heavy gear. Another slow push through rice paddies and thick vegetation, sweating under the weight of rifles, radios, and flak jackets. But as they moved deeper into the valley, several Marines noticed something unusual. The jungle was too quiet. No birds, no farmers, no movement. Even the insects seemed to fall silent. And for the men walking point, that silence felt like the first crack of thunder before a storm. Up ahead, hidden in the tree line and buried into the earth, an entire NVA force was waiting, patient, disciplined, and ready to unleash hell the moment the Marines stepped into the kill zone. D Company didn't know it yet, but they were walking straight into a trap designed to wipe them out. The first shots came so fast, so violently, that several Marines didn't even know what direction the fire was coming from. One moment, D Company was pushing through tangled vegetation. The next, the entire valley erupted around them. Automatic fire ripped through the trees. RPG screamed overhead. Mortars slammed into the ground, shaking the earth beneath their boots. Within seconds, Marines were diving for cover, shouting over the deafening roar of gunfire. D Company had walked straight into a kill zone. Enemy fire came from all sides, from hidden bunkers, camouflage, spider holes, and elevated tree lines where NVA machine gunners had perfect fields of fire. The NVA hadn't just prepared an ambush, they had engineered it. Every angle was covered, every escape route cut off, every movement exposed. Radio operators hit the ground first, pressing their antennas low as they tried to call in support. "We're surrounded. Request immediate assistance. Taking heavy fire. We need reinforcements now." Their voices cracked with urgency. This wasn't a firefight. This was survival. Marines scrambled for whatever cover they could find. A small ditch, a cluster of bamboo, a fallen tree trunk. But none of it felt safe. Bullets sliced branches above their heads. Dirt kicked up inches from their faces. Every time someone tried to move, the NVA zeroed in. A squad leader shouted, "Keep moving! Don't let them pin you down!" But movement was exactly what the enemy was waiting for. When a fire team attempted to shift positions, an RPG slammed into the ground just ahead of them, sending a shock wave through the formation. Men hit the deck hard, ears ringing, adrenaline flooding their veins. Within minutes, casualties mounted. Corpsmen sprinted through machine gun fire to reach the wounded. Rifles jammed with dirt as Marines dragged their brothers to safer positions. Ammo belts were passed from man to man like lifelines. And above it all, the enemy kept coming. The NVA force wasn't small, it wasn't scattered. It was coordinated, disciplined, and determined to crush D Company before help could arrive. Their tactics were sharp: suppress, isolate, overwhelm. For the Marines on the ground, time slowed. The air grew thicker with smoke. The jungle dimmed under the canopy of explosions, and the realization began to settle in. They might not get out of this. Back at the battalion headquarters, a company received the call no commander ever wants to hear. D Company is pinned, badly pinned. Without hesitation, a company was ordered to move, to break through enemy lines and reach the trapped Marines before the valley swallowed them whole. But they had no idea what they were walking into. No idea how strong the enemy force truly was. And no idea that they too were about to be pulled into one of the most brutal engagements of the war. For D Company, the nightmare deepened. Ammo was running low. The wounded were piling up. Enemy fire was tightening around them like a tightening noose. Still, the Marines refused to break. Machine gunners laid down bursts to buy seconds of breathing room. Grenadiers lobbed rounds into tree lines they couldn't even see. Riflemen crawled through mud to drag brothers out of exposed positions. Every Marine on that line understood the same truth. If they fell back, they would die. If they stayed still, they would die. If help didn't arrive soon, everyone would die. This wasn't just the beginning of Operation Swift. This was the moment the battle turned from strategy into a desperate fight for survival. As D Company fought to keep from being overrun, a company pushed forward through the valley, unaware that the same enemy force that had surrounded D Company was now shifting its fire toward them. The moment a company crossed the open rice paddies, the valley lit up again. Gunfire tore across the field. Rounds snapped past their helmets. Marines hit the ground instantly, returning fire as best they could. But the NVA had the advantage. They were dug in, concealed, and firing from elevated positions. Every step a company took felt like walking deeper into a storm of bullets. Still, they moved. "Keep advancing! We have to reach them!" The order echoed across the field, but each meter forward came with a price. Marines fell, hit before they could reach cover. Machine gun teams dropped their tripods and fired from the open, trying to suppress bunkers they could barely see. Radio operators begged for support, and finally, support arrived. Air power, The first jet screamed overhead, dropping ordnance so close to the Marines that they felt the heat of the explosions roll across their backs. The shock waves slammed into their chests like sledgehammers. Dirt and smoke filled the sky. Trees shattered. Bunkers blew apart. But the enemy didn't break. Moments after the bombs hit, gunfire erupted again. Just as heavy, just as disciplined. It was as if the jungle itself was fighting back. Artillery joined in next. Round after round thundered into the hillsides. Napalm streaked across the tree line in glowing waves. The valley turned into a boiling cauldron of fire and smoke. But even with all that firepower, the Marines could barely gain ground. Every time a company tried to move forward, new bursts of automatic fire pinned them down. The NVA had layers of defenses. Bunkers leading to tunnels, tunnels leading to more firing positions. It was a fortress carved into the earth. As the fight dragged on, D Company's situation grew even worse. Their perimeter was shrinking, their ammo was bleeding dry, and the enemy was getting closer. One Marine shouted, "They're trying to flank us!" Another yelled for more grenades. Corpsmen were everywhere, dragging wounded men to shallow depressions that barely counted as cover. Then came one of the most desperate moments of the day. With enemy troops closing to within just a few dozen meters, Marines called for danger close airstrikes. So close that even a slightly off-target run could kill their own men. But they had no choice. The pilots came in low, hugging the tree line, delivering their payloads with precision honed from endless practice. The blasts were deafening. The heat seared the leaves above the Marines' heads. Shrapnel rained down like metal hail. For a few precious seconds, the firing thinned. And that was all the Marines needed. Both A and D Company used the brief lull to regroup, redistribute ammo, and drag more wounded into cover. But everyone knew it was temporary. The enemy wasn't retreating, they were repositioning. A radio operator reported breathlessly, "Enemy forces are regrouping for another assault." Another assault, another wave, another chance to wipe out the men on the ground. The Marines braced themselves, tightening their grips on rifles slick with sweat and mud. Their ears rang from the explosions. Their uniforms were torn, soaked with blood. Some of it theirs, some of it not. This wasn't just combat. This was hell on earth, second by second, foot by foot. And deep within the smoke and chaos, one thought pushed every Marine forward. If they broke now, the entire valley, and everyone in it, would be lost. In the chaos of Operation Swift, with bullets slicing through the air and explosions tearing apart the jungle, something extraordinary happened. Amid the panic, fear, and smoke, the battlefield revealed the kind of courage that defies explanation. The kind that only appears when everything seems lost. And no story from that day is more powerful than the story of Chaplain Vincent Capodanno. He wasn't carrying a weapon. He wasn't wearing body armor. He had nothing but his faith, his voice, and the absolute conviction that no Marine should die alone. When word reached him that Marines were trapped, wounded, and being overrun, Capodanno didn't hesitate. Despite incoming fire, he sprinted toward the sound of gunshots. Not away, toward, through grass that was shredded by bullets. Across open ground where even seasoned infantrymen crawled on their stomachs. Marines shouted at him to get down, to take cover, to stay back, but he ignored them. Every time someone called out, "Corpsman," or "I'm hit," he turned and ran to them, crawling beside them, shielding them with his own body, whispering prayers, offering whatever comfort he could while rounds cracked overhead. At one point, a burst of machine gun fire tore into his arm and shoulder. He collapsed. Blood soaked through his shirt, but instead of pulling back, Capodanno pushed himself to his feet and kept moving. Deeper into the firefight, deeper into the kill zone where wounded Marines were still lying exposed. Another Marine, barely conscious, later remembered seeing the chaplain approach him and thinking, "What is he doing here? He's going to get killed." He was right, but Capodanno didn't care. His final act came when he spotted a wounded corpsman pinned down by an enemy machine gun. Without hesitation, Capodanno ran toward him, unarmed, injured, and fully exposed, trying to reach the man before the next burst of fire. He didn't make it. Chaplain Vincent Capodanno was killed just meters from the Marine he was trying to save. for his actions that day, actions that went far beyond duty, beyond courage. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. But Capodanno wasn't the only hero on the field. All across the valley, Marines were performing acts of bravery that would never make headlines, but would mean the difference between life and death for the men beside them. A machine gun team, low on ammo and under direct fire, refused to abandon their weapon. They held their position until reinforcements arrived, firing short, controlled bursts to keep the enemy back even as NVA troops crawled within grenade range. A young rifleman, barely 19, exposed himself to enemy fire while dragging 2 wounded Marines out of an open field. When asked later why he did it, he simply said, "They would have done it for me." Corpsmen raced from casualty to casualty, using their own bodies as shields while treating bleeding wounds, plugging holes with bandages in hands, refusing to stop even when shrapnel tore into their legs. Squad leaders moved through the chaos, shouting orders, pointing out targets, calming panicked Marines. Some were hit multiple times but kept directing their men until they could no longer stand. These weren't isolated moments. This was the character of the fight. Operation Swift pushed Marines to their physical and emotional limits. It was the kind of battle where survival depended not on luck, but on the men beside you, on teamwork, grit, and acts of courage that defy logic. And as reinforcements arrived and the battle expanded, those acts of bravery continued, because even though the Marines were exhausted, low on ammo, and outnumbered, they refused to break. By September 7th, the Marines had been fighting for days, and the valley still refused to give them back. Reinforcements arrived, but so did new waves of enemy fighters. The jungle, once silent and humid, had transformed into a roaring battlefield where every ridgeline, every trench, and every bunker hid danger. What began as a rescue mission had now exploded into a full-scale engagement with elements of the NVA 2nd Division. A new force enters the fight. The arrival of 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, 3-5, changed the tempo of the operation. These were hardened, battle-tested Marines, and their entrance signaled one thing. The fight wasn't ending. It was building. Commanders ordered coordinated assaults on suspected NVA strongpoints. The enemy wasn't just scattered. They were dug into a vast network of interconnected bunkers, tunnels, and camouflaged fighting positions. Marines advancing through the valley found themselves stepping into a maze of pre-sighted kill zones. A rifle squad would crest a small hill only to come under fire from 3 different angles. Machine gun teams would set up to cover advancing units and instantly draw fire from enemy positions hidden deep within the tree line. Every fallen tree, every mound of dirt, every shadow had the potential to erupt into violence. The bunker complexes. The NVA's bunkers were masterful works of engineering, logs thick as a man's thigh, layers of earth piled overhead, and firing slits so narrow they were nearly invisible. Marines fought tooth and nail to clear them. Grenades went in first, then rifle fire. Then fire teams charged forward, using bayonets and shotguns to finish the job in close quarters. In many cases, Marines thought they had wiped out a position, only for NVA troops to emerge from hidden tunnels behind them, firing at their flanks or throwing grenades. It wasn't just a battlefield. It was a labyrinth designed to bleed attackers dry. Night attacks, the hours no one forget. As darkness fell on the September 7th, the enemy launched a ferocious nighttime counterattack. It began with whistles, eerie, chilling blasts echoing through the valley. Then came the mortar rounds, arcing overhead and exploding across the Marine positions. Shadows moved between the trees. NVA soldiers charged in small, disciplined waves, attempting to break through the perimeter. Marines fired flares into the sky, illuminating a scene that looked like something torn from a nightmare. Figures sprinting through smoke, the flash of rifles, the thump of grenades, shouts of "incoming" and "hold the line." During these night battles, distances collapsed. Some fighting happened at such close range that Marines could hear the enemy speaking, could see their silhouettes crouching in the fog of their own breath. One Marine described it later. It felt like the jungle was alive and trying to kill us. But the Marines held. They always held. The day's grind. On September 8th, 9th, and 10th were a blur of violence and exhaustion. Patrols pushed into new sections of the valley, only to uncover even more fortified enemy positions. Each ridge they captured revealed another dug-in defense. Each assault took a toll, physically, mentally, emotionally. Heat and humidity drained them. Ammo ran low at the worst moments. Corpsmen worked nonstop, treating shrapnel wounds, bullet holes, burns, and shock. Still, the Marines pushed forward, because every bunker destroyed, every enemy position overrun, brought them one step closer to breaking the NVA's grip on the valley. A brutal realization. By the 10th day, commanders understood something critical. This wasn't just an ambush. This wasn't a raid. This was a major NVA operation, and Operation Swift had collided with it head-on. The Marines weren't just fighting to rescue a trapped company anymore. They were fighting to keep the entire Quezon Valley from collapsing into enemy hands. Against overwhelming odds, day after day, they refused to retreat, refused to surrender ground, refused to let the enemy dictate the fight. But the battle wasn't over yet, because although the Marines were beginning to crack the enemy's defensive shell, the turning point was still to come. By the 11th day of fighting, something in the valley had changed. The enemy was still fierce, still entrenched, still launching counterattacks with the same discipline they had from the beginning, but their movements were starting to slow. The Marines could feel it, not confidence, not relief, but a shift. The kind that only comes after days of relentless combat where both sides have pushed themselves to the edge. And now, finally, the tide was beginning to turn. Air power takes control. From the start of Operation Swift, close air support had been vital. But as the days dragged on, the pilots became even more aggressive, dropping ordnance closer and closer to Marine positions. Strike aircraft flew so low that Marines could see the helmets of the pilots inside. And when the smoke cleared from each run, the effect was undeniable. Bunkers collapsed, tree lines shredded, entire NVA platoons scattered or wiped out. The jungle itself seemed to be disappearing under the weight of bombs, napalm, and cannon fire. What had once been a dense green maze was now a scarred battlefield, stripped of the concealment that had made the enemy nearly invincible. For the first time since September 4th, the Marines could see where the enemy was hiding. Relentless ground pressure. Air power alone couldn't win the valley. Ground troops still had to move in, identify targets, destroy tunnels, and secure every inch of terrain. This is where the Marines excelled. 3/5 and 1/5 began coordinating tighter assaults, leapfrogging between ridges, using combined fire and maneuver tactics to punch through bunker lines that would have stopped less experienced units cold. Fire teams advanced while machine gunners laid down suppressive fire. Grenadiers targeted concealed rifleman pits. Demolition teams crawled forward to destroy tunnel entrances. Every attack was deliberate, methodical, and devastating. And slowly, bunker by bunker, ridge by ridge, the NVA strongpoints began to crumble. The enemy begins to break. Reports from the front lines were unmistakable. Enemy fire was becoming less coordinated. Reinforcements were arriving slower. Abandoned weapons and equipment were being found in hastily evacuated positions. Even prisoners, rare in such a brutal fight, hinted at what commanders suspected. The NVA wasn't retreating because they wanted to. They were retreating because they had to. They had thrown everything into Operation Swift, and now they were running out of time, out of men, and out of positions to fall back to. The psychological shift for Marines who had spent days under the crushing pressure of ambushes, night attacks, and near overrun moments, this shift was powerful. They weren't invincible. They knew that. But now they could feel the enemy weakening. They could feel momentum turning in their favor. Instead of reacting to enemy movements, the Marines were driving them. Instead of being pinned down, they were pushing forward. Instead of surviving, they were taking the fight to the enemy. One platoon commander later said, "We didn't win the valley in one moment. We broke them little by little until they couldn't hold the line anymore." A hard-earned turning point. By the end of September 10th, what remained of the NVA's once formidable presence in the Quezon Valley was fractured and exhausted. They were still dangerous, still capable of ambushes and resistance, but the operational tempo had shifted. The Marines finally had room to breathe, room to reorganize, room to prepare for the final push that would drive the enemy out for good. Operation Swift had reached its turning point, but there was still one more brutal phase ahead, one that would demand every remaining ounce of strength the Marines had left. By September 11th, the Marines weren't just fighting a battle anymore. They were dismantling an entire enemy stronghold piece by piece. The turning point had passed, but the valley was still far from safe. The NVA didn't simply disappear. They faded into the terrain, using every fold of earth, every patch of brush, every hidden tunnel to delay the inevitable. What followed over the next several days was not a single dramatic clash, but a relentless grind through some of the toughest terrain and deadliest positions the Marines had faced yet. Hunting the last strong points, Marine patrols fanned out across the valley, moving methodically through fields, ridgelines, and broken forests. Their mission was clear: find every bunker, destroy every tunnel, eliminate every remaining threat. But the NVA made them fight for every meter. Scattered pockets of resistance launched sudden bursts of fire before vanishing down escape routes. Machine gun nests popped up in places that had been quiet for days. Booby traps lay hidden beneath foliage or buried under seemingly innocent patches of dirt. A single careless step could trigger a grenade or a punji trap. A single missed movement in the tree line could become an ambush. The Marines learned to move slowly, deliberately, a balance between caution and aggression. Fire teams covered one another. Squad leaders scanned the ground with trained eyes, and corpsmen stayed close, ready to respond at a moment's notice. Tunnel warfare. One of the most difficult parts of the clearing phase was dealing with the enemy's extensive tunnel network. Some entrances were disguised as termite mounds or tree roots. Others were hidden under logs or inside destroyed huts. When a tunnel was found, Marines had two choices. 1. Send someone in. 2. Blow it apart. Neither option was comfortable. Tunnel rats, usually the smallest Marines, crawled into the darkness with only a pistol and a flashlight, unsure if they would find empty corridors, deadly traps, or an enemy soldier waiting just a few feet ahead. When demolition teams set charges, the blast would shake the ground and throw dirt into the air, collapsing entire underground chambers in a single violent moment. The deeper the Marines went, the more they realized the scale of the enemy operation. These weren't simple fighting holes. They were underground cities built to survive weeks of combat, the enemy's final pushes. Even with their lines collapsing, the NVA remained dangerous. In several areas, Marines encountered sudden, desperate counterattacks, small groups of enemy soldiers launching last-ditch efforts to break through the tightening perimeter. These weren't coordinated assaults. They were acts of stubborn resistance from units that refused to surrender the valley completely. But the Marines held every time. Superior fire discipline, communication, and overwhelming grit allowed them to repel these final bursts of violence. Each failed counterattack weakened the NVA further. A valley transformed by September 14th, the Quezon Valley no longer resembled the place where the battle had begun. Jungle had been blasted apart by artillery. Rice paddies were torn with craters. Smoke hung low in the humid air. The ground was littered with destroyed bunkers, twisted equipment, and signs of the enemy's hurried retreat. Marines walked through areas that had been near suicidal to enter just days before, now cleared, secured, and quiet. Too quiet, because beneath the relief was a heavy realization. This victory had cost them deeply. Exhaustion sets. And by the time September 15 arrived, the Marines were physically drained and mentally worn down. Many hadn't slept more than a few hours in days. Their uniforms were torn, soaked, and stained with dirt and blood. Their faces were gaunt, eyes hollowed by days of constant vigilance. But they had done it. The valley was no longer an NVA stronghold. The ambush that had nearly destroyed D Company had been turned into a full-scale Marine victory. And the enemy forces that had once threatened to swallow the entire region were now shattered. Operation Swift was entering its final chapter. But before anyone could rest, before anyone could celebrate, the Marines had to take stock of what they had paid for this ground with. That reckoning begins in the next section. When the smoke finally settled over the Quezon Valley and the last echoes of gunfire faded into the mountains, the Marines were left standing in a landscape forever changed. But victory in Vietnam rarely came without a price, and Operation Swift was no exception. As units regrouped, counted heads, and reported in, the staggering human cost of the battle began to emerge. Marine casualties over the course of the 11-day battle, the Marines suffered 114 killed in action, more than 300 wounded. For a single operation, those numbers were devastating. Some rifle companies had lost a quarter of their men. Others returned from the valley with only a handful of original members still standing. Individual platoons were nearly unrecognizable. The faces changed, the voices quieter, the weight of what they'd endured heavy in every expression. Corpsmen moved among the survivors, checking wounds that had been ignored during the heat of battle. Officers took silent roll calls, pausing when names went unanswered. Marines searched for friends who hadn't made it back, walking among the grass and burnt-out foliage, calling out names they knew would never be answered again. For many of them, Operation Swift wasn't just another firefight, it was the battle, the one that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Enemy casualties estimates placed NVA and Viet Cong losses at 500 to 600 killed. Dozens more, captured or wounded. The number was significant, but what mattered more was who those casualties represented. Many belonged to elite units of the NVA 2nd Division, troops specifically trained, equipped, and positioned to challenge Marine dominance in the region. By decimating these forces, Operation Swift dealt a severe blow to NVA operations throughout central Vietnam. Enemy weapons recovered included machine guns, rocket launchers, dozens of AK-47s, mortars, maps, orders, and crucial intelligence documents. This intelligence would later help guide Marine operations in the months leading up to the Tet Offensive. Territorial gains. For all its brutality, Operation Swift achieved what it set out to do. The Marines prevented the NVA from overrunning the Khe Sanh Valley. Enemy supply routes were disrupted. Their operational momentum was shattered. Marine positions across the region were stabilized. Swift didn't end the NVA presence. Nothing in Vietnam was ever that simple, but it forced them to abandon their planned offensive and rethink their approach in Normancourt. A quiet, heavy moment. In the days after the battle, Marines began gathering their fallen. Some were carried out on stretchers, others were loaded onto helicopters. Silent, solemn flights that cut through the humid air. Dog tags were collected. Rifles and helmets were lined up for unit memorials. Men who had fought side by side stood shoulder to shoulder again, this time in tribute. Operation Swift had ended, but its impact, its weight, its memory, would echo through the ranks of the 1st Marine Division for decades. And while the enemy had suffered greater numbers, the Marines knew one truth all too well. Every inch of ground gained in the valley had been purchased with American blood. Operation Swift was more than a rescue mission, more than a desperate stand, more than a bloody fight in a remote Vietnamese valley. It was a battle that revealed the shifting shape of the entire war. When commanders and historians look back at September 1967, they don't just see the casualties or the tactical actions. They see a moment when the North Vietnamese strategy became unmistakably clear, and when the U.S. Marines proved once again why they were considered one of the fiercest fighting forces in the world. A major NVA offensive stopped cold intelligence recovered after the battle made something absolutely clear. The NVA hadn't planned a small ambush. They had planned a major offensive, one designed to break Marine control of the Khe Sanh Valley and push U.S. forces out of the region entirely. If D Company had been destroyed, and if reinforcements had been slowed or stopped, the NVA could have overrun outposts, cut supply lines, seized high ground overlooking Marine bases, opened a corridor for larger operations deeper into I Corps. But Operation Swift shattered those plans. The Marines didn't just survive the initial ambush. They turned it around and smashed some of the NVA's best units in the process. The enemy's momentum was broken, and their timetable for further operations in the area was disrupted. A preview of Tet, in hindsight, Operation Swift offers a chilling preview of what was coming just a few months later. The Tet Offensive. The NVA's coordination, their use of fortified positions, their willingness to commit entire battalions to sudden, dramatic attacks, their mastery of terrain, their ability to hide large forces right under American noses. All of these elements appeared in Swift and then appeared again during Tet. Operation Swift was an early warning, a sign that the enemy was preparing something massive, something nationwide, something designed to shock American forces on every front. At the time, few understood just how big that coming storm would be. But Swift showed the shape of things to come. Marines, overmatched, outnumbered, but unbroken. Perhaps the most important takeaway from Operation Swift was what it proved about the Marines themselves. Against overwhelming numbers, a well-prepared enemy, in some of the worst terrain imaginable, small units held their ground with discipline, firepower, ingenuity, and unbreakable determination. The enemy had every advantage: surprise, preparation, terrain, yet the Marines refused to collapse. Their ability to coordinate reinforcements under fire, call in close air support with pinpoint accuracy, and launch counterattacks against fortified positions demonstrated tactical skill that few militaries on Earth could match. Operation Swift was a reminder that the U.S. Marine Corps could not be intimidated or driven out of a fight, no matter how desperate the odds. Securing the Quai Son Valley. In the short term, the Marines achieved what they set out to do. The NVA's foothold was weakened, their planned offensive was derailed. The valley remained under American and ARVN control, and Marine units maintained strategic access to key terrain and supply routes. The battle didn't end enemy activity in the valley. Nothing in Vietnam was ever that permanent, but it reset the balance of power and forced the NVA to reorganize, delaying future operations. A legacy of sacrifice in the end, Operation Swift is remembered not just for its tactical importance, but for its human legacy. The courage of Marines who fought through ambushes, night attacks, bunker complexes, and overwhelming firepower. It stands as a testament to what small units can accomplish under impossible circumstances. It stands as a warning about the enemy's growing strength and preparation. And it stands as a powerful chapter in the story of the war. A chapter that reminds us that even when victory is achieved, it often comes at a cost that echoes long after the fighting ends. When the Marines finally left the Quai Son Valley, they didn't march out as the same men who had gone in. The valley had changed them, carved something into them that would stay long after the war ended. They had fought 11 days of brutal, unforgiving combat. They had seen ambushes explode around them, watched friends fall beside them, and push through fear, exhaustion, and impossible odds. And still, they held their ground. Operation Swift wasn't just a battle. It was a testament to endurance, to brotherhood, to the sacrifices made far from home, in a valley most Americans had never heard of. The Marines didn't ask for glory. They didn't ask for recognition. They just did what Marines do. They stood their ground and refused to break. Today, decades later, the story of Operation Swift stands as a reminder of everything this war demanded. Courage under fire, strength in the face of overwhelming odds, and the kind of loyalty that only forms when lives depend on it. It reminds us that history isn't just made by generals and strategies, but by the young men in muddy boots, carrying rifles heavier than their fear, fighting inch by inch for the Marine beside them. And remembering them, honoring what they endured, is why we tell these stories. Before we wrap up, I want to speak directly to all of you watching. This channel is built on your support, your comments, your shares, your passion for forgotten battles and untold stories. That's what keeps these videos coming. And right now we are pushing hard toward 20,000 subscribers. So if you enjoyed this deep dive into Operation Swift, if you appreciate the research, the storytelling, and the effort behind these videos, hit that like button, subscribe, and let me know in the comments which Vietnam War story you want to see next. Your feedback decides the next upload. Your support grows this community, and together we keep these stories alive. Thank you for watching. Thank you for supporting the channel. And above all, thank you for honoring the men who fought in battles the world must never forget. There are only a few snipers over there. Go get them. That's what Lieutenant Colonel Woodham told his Marines on the morning of May 18, 1968. Companies K and L moved forward to clear out what their commander believed were just a handful of enemy soldiers hiding in the hamlet of Labac, Vietnam. Within minutes, the few snipers erupted into an exceedingly heavy volume of automatic weapons fire. Marines were pinned down, isolated, unable to move. The air filled with the crack of AK-47s, the thump of mortars, and the screams of wounded men, calling for corpsmen who couldn't reach them. By the end of that day, 28 Marines were dead. Company I had been virtually wiped out. 20 men killed, dozens more wounded. The few snipers turned out to be battalions from one of North Vietnam's most elite units, the 36th Regiment of the legendary 308th Division. This was Go Noi Island, and for 3.5 months in 1968, it would become one of the most savage killing grounds of the entire Vietnam War. 172 Americans would die here. More than 1,100 would be wounded. Some of them had been truck drivers and cooks just weeks before, hastily converted into infantry and thrown into combat against seasoned North Vietnamese regulars. Most Americans have never heard of Operation Allen Brook. There are no Hollywood movies about it, no famous photographs, no memorials. But for the young Marines who fought and died in the hedgerows and rice paddies of Go Noi Island in the summer of 1968, it was as real and as brutal as any battle in American history. This is their story. Go Noi Island wasn't really an island at all. Located 15 miles south of Da Nang in Quang Nam Province, this 2-square-mile patch of farmland was surrounded by rivers and roads. The Song Thu Bon River to the north, the Kai Lam River to the south, and a railroad berm that cut through the middle like a scar. The Americans called it an island, but it was really just isolated, enemy-controlled territory in the heart of hostile country. The Marines had a nickname for the area just north of Go Noi Island, Dodge City. They called it that because every time you went there, you were guaranteed a gunfight. Ambushes, firefights, snipers. Dodge City had it all. And if Dodge City was dangerous, Go Noi Island was a death trap. The terrain seemed ordinary enough. Flat rice paddies, small villages, bamboo groves, thick hedgerows separating the fields. But this simplicity was deceiving. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army had spent years turning Go Noi Island into a fortress. The small hamlets scattered across the island were connected by thick hedgerows and concealed paths that provided perfect cover for ambushes. Beneath the ground, an intricate network of tunnels, bunkers, and fighting positions allowed enemy soldiers to appear, attack, and disappear like ghosts. The bamboo groves offered excellent concealment. The hedgerows channeled advancing forces into predetermined kill zones. Every trail could be booby-trapped. Every tree line could hide a machine gun nest. Every hamlet could contain enemy soldiers ready to fight to the death. For years, Go Noi Island had served as a crucial staging area for communist forces preparing to attack Da Nang. It was the headquarters for the Viet Cong's Group 44, which controlled operations throughout Quang Nam Province. The R-20 and V-25 Viet Cong battalions operated from the island, along with the T-3 Sapper Battalion, elite commando units trained in infiltration and demolition. Intelligence believed that elements of the PAVN 2nd Division were also using the island as a base. No American or South Vietnamese force had entered the western end of Go Noi Island in almost a year. The enemy owned this ground completely. They knew every trail, every hiding spot, every vantage point. They had prepared their defenses carefully, stockpiling ammunition and supplies, building fortifications, laying mines and booby traps. The Marines were about to walk into a nightmare. By late April 1968, American intelligence had detected something alarming. Just 2 months earlier, during the Tet Offensive, the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong had launched simultaneous attacks on cities and bases throughout South Vietnam. Though the offensive had been a tactical failure, the Communists suffered devastating casualties. It had shocked the American public and changed the political landscape of the war. Now, in the spring of 1968, the enemy was preparing to strike again. Through reconnaissance teams and limited combat engagements, Marine intelligence determined that the North Vietnamese had moved the equivalent of an entire NVA division into the area south of Da Nang. Reconnaissance Stingray teams reported sightings of large enemy troop movements, groups of 60 to 80 North Vietnamese soldiers moving through the jungle with full combat gear. The Communists were staging for what would become known as the May Offensive, or Mini-Tet, another coordinated series of attacks designed to put pressure on American forces and shake public support for the war back home. Da Nang was one of the most important American installations in South Vietnam. The sprawling base complex housed thousands of troops, massive supply depots, and critical air operations. If the North Vietnamese could mass forces on Go Noi Island undetected and unopposed, they could launch devastating attacks on Da Nang itself, rocketing the airfield, hitting supply convoys, and creating chaos in the city. Major General Don Robertson, the commanding general of the 1st Marine Division, wasn't going to let that happen. Up until now, the defense of Da Nang had been reactive. Marines heavily patrolled a rocket belt that extended in a semicircle around the city, trying to intercept enemy rocket teams before they could fire on the base. But Robertson had fresh troops available. The 27th Marines had recently arrived in country, and he decided on a more aggressive strategy. Instead of waiting for the enemy to attack, the Marines would take the fight to him. They would conduct deep-reaching, mobile operations that would disrupt enemy preparations and keep NVA forces away from Da Nang entirely. The enemy wouldn't be allowed to stage unmolested on Go Noi Island. The Marines would cross onto the island, find the North Vietnamese, and destroy them. On May 4, 1968, Operation Allen Brook began. Colonel Reverdy Hall, commander of the 7th Marines, had overall control of the operation. The first unit committed was his 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, 2-7 in Marine Corps shorthand. On the morning of May 4th, 2 companies from 2-7 Marines, supported by M48 tanks, crossed Liberty Bridge onto the western edge of Go Noi Island. They began advancing eastward toward the railway berm that bisected the area, moving carefully through the rice paddies and hedgerows, searching hamlets for enemy soldiers and weapons. For the first few days, resistance was surprisingly light, a few snipers here and there, brief exchanges of fire, but nothing major. By May 7th, Company A from 1st Battalion, 7th Marines had relieved one of the companies from 2-7, and Company K from 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines was added to the operation. The Marines were expanding their footprint on the island, probing deeper into enemy territory. But something felt wrong. The veterans knew it. Where was the enemy? Where were the fortifications intelligence had reported? Where were the battalions of North Vietnamese soldiers that reconnaissance teams had spotted? The answer came on the evening of May 9th. Marines from 2-7 encountered heavy resistance at the hamlet of Xuan Dai. What had been a cautious patrol suddenly exploded into a savage close-quarters battle. The North Vietnamese were dug into fortified positions, and they fought with a discipline and ferocity that shocked even veteran Marines. Machine gun fire raked the Marine positions. Mortars began falling. The enemy wouldn't budge. Airstrikes were called in. F-4 Phantoms screamed overhead, dropping bombs and napalm on the hamlet. Artillery pounded enemy positions. And finally, the Marines overran the hamlet in brutal house-to-house fighting. When the smoke cleared, 80 North Vietnamese soldiers lay dead. But the Marines had paid a price too. Casualties were mounting. The enemy had revealed himself, and now the Marines understood what they were really facing. Intelligence would soon determine that the enemy force was the 36th Regiment of the 308th Division, one of the most famous units in the entire North Vietnamese Army. The 308th Division was legendary. It was one of the original steel and iron divisions that had defeated the French at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, ending French colonial rule in Indochina. The division had a history stretching back to the earliest days of the Viet Minh, and its soldiers were among the best trained and most experienced in the communist forces. The 36th Regiment had only recently arrived in South Vietnam, having departed North Vietnam in February 1968. They had marched south with orders to assault Allied positions north of the Thu Bon River as part of the May Offensive. Their mission was to hit Da Nang hard and create chaos behind American lines. But the Marines had stumbled into their staging area before they were ready. And now, instead of attacking Da Nang, the 36th Regiment found itself in a fight for survival on Go Noi Island. They weren't going to leave quietly. By mid-May, Colonel Hall realized he needed to disrupt enemy plans more aggressively. Intelligence indicated that the North Vietnamese were continuing to bring forces onto Go Noi Island, preparing for their offensive. Hall came up with a bold plan. He would use deception to catch the enemy off guard. On May 15th, Marine companies began a very visible withdrawal from Gonoy Island. They swept toward Liberty Bridge in an obvious manner, making sure that any enemy observers would see them leaving. The Marines crossed the bridge, received hot food and supplies, and established defensive perimeters on the north side of the river. As rain began to fall, the exhausted troops settled in for the night, but it was all a ruse. Just after midnight on May 16th, the Marines quietly crossed back onto Gonoy Island under cover of darkness. Moving in single file to minimize noise, they traveled 2,500 meters northeast, roughly parallel to the Songthuban River. The column moved through the darkness with weapons ready, every man alert for the slightest sound or movement. At dawn, they stopped and rested in place, hidden in the vegetation. The trap was set. The Marines were deep in enemy territory, and the North Vietnamese had no idea they were there. At 9 a.m. on May 16th, the 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines ran straight into an entire North Vietnamese battalion at the hamlet of Phu Dong. The enemy was completely surprised. North Vietnamese soldiers scrambled for weapons and positions as Marine fire tore into them. But these were elite troops, and they recovered quickly. Within minutes, a massive firefight erupted. The battle raged all day. The Marines tried to outflank the enemy positions but couldn't gain an advantage. The North Vietnamese held their ground with disciplined, accurate fire. Every time a Marine fire team tried to move forward, they were met with a wall of AK-47 and machine gun fire. The NVA had turned Phu Dong into a fortress, and they weren't giving it up without a fight. Colonel Hall called in everything he had. Artillery batteries fired mission after mission, shells screaming overhead to explode in and around the hamlet. F-4 Phantoms made strafing runs, their 20mm cannons chewing up enemy positions. Attack helicopters swept in with rockets and miniguns. The battle continued through the afternoon and into the evening, the sound of explosions and gunfire echoing across the island. Marine casualties mounted. Men were hit by sniper fire, cut down by machine guns, or wounded by fragments from enemy mortars. Corpsmen moved through the chaos, treating the wounded under fire, dragging Marines to safety while bullets cracked overhead. Finally, as darkness fell, the North Vietnamese abandoned their positions and withdrew. They left behind more than 130 dead comrades. The Marines had lost 25 killed and 38 wounded. When the Marines searched Phu Dong, they discovered why the enemy had fought so hard. The hamlet had been a regimental headquarters. Inside the ruins of buildings, they found vast quantities of supplies, ammunition, medical equipment, food, documents, maps showing planned attack routes toward Da Nang, personnel rosters, communications equipment. Colonel Hall's deception had worked. The 36th Regiment's command structure had been disrupted, and their carefully prepared offensive was in disarray. But the price had been terrible, and the fighting was far from over. The casualties from the battle at Phu Dong were still being evacuated when control of Operation Allenbrook passed to a new unit. The 3rd Battalion, 27th Marines, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Woodham. The 327 Marines were different from most infantry battalions in Vietnam. When the battalion was hurriedly assembled at Camp Pendleton earlier that year, the Marine Corps had faced a critical shortage of infantry troops. So they went into the barracks at Camp Margarita and pulled Marines from all kinds of non-infantry specialties: truck drivers, mechanics, cooks, supply clerks, administrative personnel. These Marines were given basic infantry refresher training and told they were now riflemen. It was a testament to the Marine Corps philosophy that every Marine is a rifleman, first and foremost. Every Marine goes through infantry training at boot camp, regardless of their eventual job specialty. But there's a huge difference between remembering basic infantry tactics from boot camp and being a combat-experienced infantryman. Many of the Marines in 3/27 had joined the Corps to work on trucks or in kitchens, not to patrol through hostile jungle carrying a rifle. Now they were being thrown into one of the most dangerous operations of the war. On May 17th, 37 Marines arrived on Gonoy Island and took over from the battered units that had been fighting there for nearly 2 weeks. The morning of May 18th started quietly. The heat was already oppressive, temperatures soaring past 100 degrees, the humidity making it feel even hotter. At 9:30 a.m., Lieutenant Colonel Woodham began expanding his perimeter around the hamlet of Lanam when Company the 1st and Company K started taking sniper fire from Labac, about 300 meters to the north. Woodham immediately made a decision. He ordered Companies K and L to move north and clear out the snipers. He told his Marines, "There are only a few snipers over there. Go get them." The Marines moved out, advancing through the rice paddies toward Labac. They moved carefully, weapons ready, scanning the tree lines and hedgerows for movement. Then all hell broke loose. The few snipers turned out to be a formidable North Vietnamese force, elements of both the 2nd and 3rd Battalions of the 36th Regiment, and they had been waiting in prepared positions, ready to ambush the Marines. Suddenly, an exceedingly heavy volume of fire erupted from multiple positions. A K-47s, machine guns, and mortars opened up simultaneously. The lead elements of Companies K and L were caught in a kill zone, a carefully prepared ambush site where the enemy had interlocking fields of fire. Marines hit the ground, taking cover behind rice paddy dikes, in ditches, anywhere they could find protection from the incoming fire. But there was nowhere to go. Moving forward meant running into more enemy fire. Moving back meant exposing yourself to the shooters. Staying put meant slowly getting picked off by enemy marksmen who knew the terrain intimately. Companies K and L were pinned down, isolated from each other and from the rest of the battalion. Marines were scattered across several hundred meters of open rice paddies, taking fire from multiple directions. Some were wounded and couldn't move. Others tried to reach wounded comrades but were driven back by enemy fire. Lieutenant Colonel Woodham immediately called for artillery and air support. Within minutes, artillery shells began screaming overhead, exploding near enemy positions. But the Marines were so close to the North Vietnamese, sometimes just meters apart, separated only by a hedgerow or a rice paddy dike, that supporting fire was extremely limited. Fire the artillery too close, and you risked hitting your own men. Pull it back too far, and it was ineffective against the enemy. The same problem hampered close air support. Pilots couldn't tell where the Marines were and where the enemy was. Everyone was mixed together in the chaos of close-quarters combat. Some Marines could hear Vietnamese voices shouting commands just meters away. They could see muzzle flashes from enemy rifles through gaps in the vegetation. They were fighting at arm's length against an enemy they could barely see. Company I was hit the hardest. Caught in the open with limited cover, the company was systematically torn apart by North Vietnamese fire. Marines fell wounded, calling for corpsmen who risked their lives crawling through the fire to reach them. Corpsmen used their bodies to shield wounded Marines while they worked frantically to stop bleeding and stabilize injuries. The battle raged for hours. The sun beat down mercilessly on Marines lying in exposed positions, and the combination of heat, stress, and fear was overwhelming. Some Marines died from wounds. Others succumbed to heat stroke and dehydration while pinned down under fire. By the time the North Vietnamese finally withdrew that evening, the toll was devastating. Company I had been virtually wiped out. 20 Marines killed, dozens more wounded. Company K suffered heavy casualties as well. In total, 28 Marines from 327 were killed on May 18th, with 68 wounded. For many of these young men, truck drivers and cooks just weeks earlier, it had been their first real combat. Lieutenant Colonel Woodham's assurance of only a few snipers would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. That night, as the exhausted and traumatized survivors of Company I tried to rest, Company M was alerted that they would fly into the combat zone the next morning to replace them. The 327 Command Group established a position in a rice paddy south of Lanam, while the remnants of Companies Terroir in K held Lanam itself and Company L moved east. The battle for Go Noi Island had become a meat grinder, and it was nowhere close to being over. Through late May and into June, Operation Allen Brook continued as a grinding, exhausting campaign of patrols, ambushes, and sudden firefights. Additional Marine battalions rotated onto the island. On May 26th, the 1st Battalion, 26 Marines reinforced the operation. On May 28th, the battered 3rd Battalion, 27th Marines was finally relieved and sent to the rear to rest and receive replacements. But no matter how many Marines were committed to the operation, the pattern remained the same. The North Vietnamese avoided large-scale battles, instead conducting hit-and-run attacks that steadily bled American forces. They knew the terrain intimately and could attack or withdraw at will. For every hamlet the Marines cleared, the enemy would simply move to another area and wait for another opportunity to ambush a patrol. On June 5th, Marine battalions moving west along the island were ambushed by PAM forces at the hamlet of Cu Ban. Once again, the proximity of enemy forces made supporting fire largely ineffective, and another confused, close-quarters battle raged throughout the day. Only when Me-48 tanks arrived and began blasting enemy positions with their 90mm guns were the Marines able to overrun the North Vietnamese bunkers. 7 Marines were killed and 55 wounded. 30 North Vietnamese soldiers were found dead in and around their fighting positions. The heat was relentless. Temperatures regularly exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and the humidity was suffocating. Marines carried heavy loads of ammunition, weapons, water, and equipment through the sticky mud of rice paddies and the thick vegetation of hedgerows. Heat exhaustion and heat stroke claimed almost as many casualties as enemy fire. Men collapsed from dehydration. Others suffered from tropical diseases, infections from minor wounds that wouldn't heal in the filthy conditions, and injuries from booby traps and punji stakes. By early June, American commanders had reached a stark conclusion. The terrain of Go Noi Island itself was the enemy's greatest advantage. As long as the hedgerows, bamboo groves, tree lines, and concealed paths existed, the North Vietnamese would be able to use them for ambushes and attacks. The island's defensive network was simply too strong. There was only one solution: destroy the island itself. On June 6th, the nature of Operation Allen Brook changed completely. The 1st Battalion, 26 Marines was withdrawn, and elements of the 1st Engineer Battalion arrived with heavy equipment: bulldozers, tractors, and Rome plows designed for land clearing. The new mission was unprecedented in its scope: the systematic destruction of everything on Go Noi Island that could provide cover or concealment to the enemy. The orders called for total destruction of natural assembly areas, concealing foliage, tree lines, bamboo groves, hedgerows, trench lines, fighting holes, caves, bunkers, tunnels, building structures, anything that could be used by enemy forces. Materials that could be used to build fortifications, concrete blocks, beams, posts, pillars, tree trunks, would be destroyed by crushing or burning. Lieutenant Colonel Albert W. Keller, one of the battalion commanders involved in the operation, summed it up bluntly: "We were to level that island." And that's exactly what they did. Marine infantry battalions provided security while engineers moved methodically across Go Noi Island with bulldozers and tractors. The Provisional Land Clearing Company, equipped with Marine IMCO M64 tractors and Army D7E bulldozers, began scraping the island clean. Everything in their path was destroyed. Trees were uprooted, hedgerows were torn down, buildings were demolished, tunnels were collapsed. The work was dangerous. The engineers constantly hit mines and booby traps. 2 tractors were disabled by landmines on the first day of operations. But the work continued. Day after day, week after week, the bulldozers moved across the island, destroying 97 tunnels, over 2,000 bunkers and fighting positions, and 3.2 kilometers of trenches. In total, more than 8,000 acres, about 12.5 square miles, were completely flattened. What had once been a patchwork of villages, rice paddies, and thick vegetation became a barren, cratered wasteland. On July 18th and 21st, the destruction intensified even further. Aircraft sprayed the island with herbicides, Agent Orange, and other powerful defoliants, ensuring that nothing would grow back quickly. The communist forces, watching their sanctuary being systematically erased, fired on the spray aircraft, but the missions continued. While the land-clearing operations proceeded, the Marines continued to encounter enemy resistance. North Vietnamese forces avoided major engagements, but harassed the Americans with sniper fire, small ambushes, and mortar attacks. On the night of June 14th, a PAVN force attacked Company B, 1st Battalion, 27th Marines in their defensive position. The attack was beaten back with 21 North Vietnamese killed and no Marine casualties. On June 19th, Companies B and D from 1st Battalion, 1st Marines were ambushed at Bac Dong Ban Hamlet, and a 9-hour battle erupted before the Marines could overrun enemy bunkers. The Communists were still there, still fighting, but slowly, inexorably, their fortress was being destroyed around them. On July 23rd, Battalion Landing Team 27 launched Operation Swift Play, a complementary operation targeting the Dutha Mountains just 6 kilometers south of Gonoy Island. This was designed to catch enemy forces that might be staging in the mountains, preventing them from reinforcing the defenders on the island. On July 31st, BLT-27 arrived on Gonoy Island itself and relieved the 3rd Battalion, 27th Marines. By August, Gonoy Island was unrecognizable. What had once been a verdant patchwork of hamlets, rice paddies, and thick vegetation was now a barren moonscape of craters and scorched earth. The defensive network that had made the island so valuable to the North Vietnamese had been systematically obliterated. Enemy activity had dwindled to minimal levels. Occasional sniper fire, sporadic mortar rounds, but true to form, the PAVN and Viet Cong continued to resist until the very end. As Marines and engineers made their final withdrawal across Liberty Bridge on August 24th, they were still being harassed by sniper fire from the few remaining enemy soldiers clinging to the ruins of their former stronghold. On August 24, 1968, Operation Allen Brook officially concluded after 3.5 months of continuous operations. The final casualty figures told a grim story. The United States had lost 172 men killed in action, 170 Marines and 2 Navy corpsmen who had died trying to save their wounded comrades. Another 1,124 Americans had been wounded, many seriously. But those numbers didn't capture the full cost. Additional Marines fell victim to heat exhaustion, tropical diseases, snake bites, accidents, and the countless other hazards of combat in Vietnam's brutal environment. The Communists had suffered 917 killed, 11 captured, and 2 who had rallied to the South Vietnamese government. Their infrastructure on Gonoy Island had been destroyed, and their plans for a major offensive against Da Nang had been disrupted. But the victory was hollow. Within months, intelligence reports indicated that Communist forces were already attempting to reoccupy Gonoy Island. The Marines would return to fight there again during Operation Pipestone Canyon in 1969. The cycle of destruction and occupation would continue until the Americans finally left Vietnam years later. Operation Allen Brook achieved its immediate tactical objectives. The North Vietnamese 36th Regiment's planned attack on Da Nang never happened. The May offensive in the Da Nang area was reduced to sporadic rocket attacks rather than a full-scale ground assault. For those few months in 1968, Gonoy Island was denied to the enemy as a staging area, but the strategic value of that achievement remains debatable. Thousands of Americans were killed or wounded for temporary control of 2 square miles of Vietnamese farmland. The enemy would return, the war would continue, and in the end, none of it mattered. Corporal Neil Gettle, the 18-year-old helicopter support group member who survived the crash of his Chinook and watched everyone else in his unit die on the first day of Operation Allen Brook, returned home to Philadelphia on Christmas Day 1968. He was met at the airport by hundreds of anti-war protesters who screamed at the returning troops and called them baby killers. But Operation Allen Brook remains one of the forgotten battles of the Vietnam War. It doesn't have the name recognition of Khe Sanh or the Ia Drang Valley. There are no major films about it, few books devoted to it, and only scattered mentions in official histories. Yet for 3.5 months in the summer of 1968, Gonoy Island was as brutal a battlefield as any in the war. 172 Americans died there. More than 1,100 were wounded. Thousands more were scarred by the experience in ways that would last the rest of their lives. Their sacrifice deserves to be remembered. Their story deserves to be told. This was Operation Allen Brook, and it should not be forgotten. 1. Operation Allen Brook, the island that devoured Marines, conquered Vietnam War, 1968-2. Only a few snipers. The deadliest lie in Vietnam. Operation Allen Brook 3, the forgotten battle that killed 172 Marines. Operation Allen Brook, 1968. There are only a few snipers over there. Go get them. Those words sent Marines in one of Vietnam's deadliest traps. Operation Allen Brook, May to August 1968, saw U.S. Marines battle elite North Vietnamese forces on Gonoi Island near Da Nang. 172 Americans died, 1,124 were wounded, many of them truck drivers and cooks hastily converted to infantry. This is the forgotten story of the island that became a killing ground. April 30th, 1968. 200 Marines walked into what intelligence called a routine operation. Enemy strength, 1 battalion. Maybe 400 fighters. Manageable odds. Within 6 hours, half of those Marines would be dead or wounded. Within 3 days, 4 American companies would be shredded, trying to take a cluster of villages near the DMZ. They'd lose more officers in 72 hours than they'd lost in 3 months. Their rifles would jam so badly, they'd start using enemy weapons just to survive. And then, after all that blood and sacrifice, they'd be ordered to abandon every inch of ground they'd fought for. This is the Battle of Dai Do, the meat grinder that history forgot. Battalion Landing Team 2. 4 earned their nickname the hard way, the Magnificent Bastards. Months of continuous operations in Northern Corps. The kind of fighting that separated professional units from everyone else. By spring 1968, they'd built a reputation. When things looked tough, they got the call. Late April found them near the DMZ, that invisible line where North and South Vietnam supposedly met, but where the war never bothered pretending borders mattered. The area was a patchwork of abandoned villages and flooded rice paddies, territory that changed hands depending on who had the firepower that week. The intelligence brief on April 29th painted a manageable picture. NVA forces had moved into the village cluster near Dai Do. 1 battalion, 400 to 500 fighters. It wasn't nothing, but it seemed workable. American firepower and Marine training usually tipped those scales. The mission looked textbook. Locate the enemy force, fix them in place, destroy or scatter them before they could regroup. Standard search and destroy. Nobody at the briefing suggested this would be different from dozens of similar operations. What the intelligence missed was scale, and that gap between expectation and reality would define everything that followed. The North Vietnamese hadn't sent a battalion into those villages. They'd positioned an entire division, the 320th NVA Division. Not hundreds of fighters, thousands. Regular soldiers with artillery support firing from across the border where American forces couldn't touch them, and they'd had days to prepare. They dug deep, reinforced bunkers in Dai Do, Dinh Tu, and An Lac, pre-positioned ammunition caches, mortars registered on every approach, machine gun positions with interlocking fields of fire, underground tunnels connecting defensive positions. This wasn't a unit trying to avoid contact. This was a force that had turned these villages into a fortress and was waiting for the Americans to walk in. The flat terrain gave them perfect sight lines. Every rice paddy became a kill zone. Every tree line hid firing positions. And when they needed reinforcements, fresh troops could cross from sanctuaries north of the DMZ where American forces were forbidden to pursue. American intelligence had picked up fragments. Aerial reconnaissance spotted some movement. Radio intercepts suggested increased activity, but nobody connected those dots into a division-sized operation. In Vietnam, intelligence was always incomplete, always pieced together from signals that didn't quite form clear pictures. Commanders made decisions based on best guesses, and sometimes those guesses missed. This time, the gap between what they thought they'd face and what actually waited in those villages would be measured in body bags. April 30th started in darkness. Companies E and F moved out before first light, advancing toward the villages as the sun began to break over the horizon. The terrain looked deceptively simple. Flat rice paddies stretching toward tree lines. The villages sitting quiet in the distance. What those paddies didn't offer was cover. Nowhere to hide when things went wrong. But intelligence said 1 battalion, and these Marines had handled worse. They kept their intervals. Officers checked maps. Radio operators stayed close. It felt routine. The first gunshot sounded almost insignificant, a single crack from a distant tree line. Then the world exploded. Machine guns opened up from every direction, interlocking fire that turned those open paddies into a shooting gallery. The volume of fire wasn't random. It was coordinated, disciplined, positions that had been prepared for days, waiting for exactly this moment. Marines hit the deck, dropping into water that barely reached their knees, trying to find cover that didn't exist. The shallow water offered no real protection, just the psychological comfort of being lower than standing height. Bullets snapped overhead with that distinctive supersonic crack, the sound that meant they were passing within inches. Then the mortars started falling. The precision suggested pre-registered targets, every grid square already plotted. The distant thump of tubes firing gave maybe 3 seconds warning. Then the shells shrieked in. Impact! Fountain of water and mud. Shock waves radiating outward in visible rings. Men hugging the ground, pressing into mud that barely mattered against high explosives. Within 5 minutes, the advance was dead in the water. What was supposed to be a quick sweep had turned into a fight for survival, and the radio calls back to battalion were painting a picture that made no sense. This wasn't one battalion. Fire was coming from every village. Coordinated, sustained, professional. The Marines were facing something much bigger than anyone had predicted, and they were caught in the open with nowhere to go. Company E's commander went down in the first exchange. One moment he was coordinating the advance. The next he was on the ground, his radio operator screaming for a corpsman. Minutes later, another officer fell. Then another. The NVA weren't just shooting at movement. They were hunting leadership. Anyone with a map became a priority target. Radio operators with visible antennas drew sniper fire. Sergeants trying to rally their squads caught mortar rounds seconds after standing up. It was systematic, deliberate, and devastatingly effective. By midday on April 30th, the magnificent bastards had lost more officers in 6 hours than they'd lost in 3 months of combat. Platoon leaders suddenly found themselves running companies. Second lieutenants fresh out of Quantico were making decisions that should have been left to majors. The transition happened instantly. No time to think. One moment you're responsible for 30 men, the next you're coordinating 100, calling in fire missions, organizing casualty evacuation, trying to maintain some kind of cohesion while bullets cracked overhead and mortars walked toward your position. Some of these young officers stepped up like they'd been doing it for years. Their voices stayed calm on the radio even as their hands shook. Training took over. Muscle memory carried them through decisions that should have paralyzed them. Others froze, not from cowardice, from the sheer impossibility of what was being asked. One lieutenant sat against a tree, helmet in his hands trembling, while his radio operator desperately tried to get him to respond. Another issued orders but couldn't track where his units were, sending men into positions already occupied by other Marines or straight into enemy kill zones. Lance corporals inherited squads. Corporals commanded platoons. In one case, a private became the senior man standing in his unit and had to figure out how to extract 30 Marines across open ground under sustained fire. They kept fighting because there was no other choice. The mission hadn't changed just because leadership was getting decimated, and abandoning the men around them wasn't something their training or character allowed. The M16 was supposed to be revolutionary, lightweight, high velocity, the rifle of the future. That's what they'd been told. In controlled conditions, it performed well enough. But Dido wasn't controlled conditions. The paddies were liquid mud. The air was thick with humidity, and firefights went on for hours without pause. That's when the rifles started failing. A Marine would be advancing under fire, squeezing rounds downrange. Then nothing. The bolt locked up. The chamber fouled. In that frozen second, with enemy machine guns still hammering away, your primary weapon became dead weight in your hands. The terror of that moment is hard to describe. You're in the middle of a firefight. Your survival depends on returning fire, and your rifle just quit. The problem was a perfect storm of issues. Cheap ammunition left residue in the gas system. The rifles lacked chrome plating. Cleaning kits hadn't caught up to the weapon's maintenance needs. After a few magazines in muddy conditions, the buildup would cause malfunctions. That's when something remarkable started happening. Marines began picking up AK-47s from fallen NVA soldiers. The Kalashnikov was heavier, less accurate at range, but it had one quality that mattered more than anything else in that moment. It worked. You could drag it through mud, drop it in water, and when you pulled the trigger, it fired. Word spread through the companies fast. If your M16 jammed and there was an AK nearby, you grabbed it. Some squads ended up with mixed armament, American and Soviet weapons side by side. Officers didn't officially approve, But they didn't stop it. When Captain Vargas saw his Marines carrying enemy rifles, he understood. Regulations didn't matter when your weapon failed in combat. Survival did. And if a communist rifle kept his men alive, that was good enough. The M16 failures affected more than individual firefights. They affected tactics. Marines became hesitant to advance when they couldn't trust their primary weapon. Suppressive fire became inconsistent. Assaults that required coordinated volleys fell apart when half the rifles jammed mid-charge. Military doctrine was clear. When you hit resistance beyond expectations, you pull back, consolidate, mass your fires, then hit again with overwhelming force. That's what the textbook said. That's what every staff college taught. But division headquarters saw withdrawal as defeat. They believed one more push would crack enemy resistance. So instead of massing force for a coordinated assault, they fed units in piecemeal, company by company, each one arriving just in time to inherit someone else's disaster. Company G got the call, moved to Dai Do, reinforce units in contact, then Company H. Each commander received fragmentary orders while already moving. They couldn't coordinate with the units they were supposed to support, couldn't get clear pictures of where friendly positions ended and enemy positions began. They just pushed forward into smoke and chaos and tried to make sense of it when they arrived. The NVA, meanwhile, had been preparing for exactly this. Fresh troops staged in tunnels throughout the complex. When one American company pushed forward, NVA reinforcements moved up through underground passages. When another company arrived, more enemy soldiers filtered in from across the DMZ. The Americans were committing battalion-sized elements one company at a time. The North Vietnamese were reinforcing with division strength. It wasn't a fair trade, and the math didn't favor the Marines. Captain Vargas led Company G into what he thought would be a reinforcement operation. What he found was chaos, no clear front line. Scattered groups of Marines taking cover wherever they could. Wounded waiting for medevacs that couldn't safely land. Ammunition running low. And enemy fire still pouring in from every direction. This wasn't reinforcing success. This was trying to prevent catastrophe. And every company that went in got pulled into the same grinding fight. By May 1st, 3rd Marine Amphibious Force was desperate enough to call in Army units from the south. The 3rd Battalion, 21st Infantry Regiment got orders to move north immediately. Their brief made it sound routine. Reinforce Marines at Dai Do, consolidate gains, mop up remaining resistance. The soldiers packed up expecting to arrive after the hard fighting was done. When they reached the area on May 2nd, reality hit hard. They got directed to Nai Ha, a village east of the main battleground. The place looked devastated. Shattered buildings, cratered paddies, and unnatural quiet. Before they could even establish positions, the NVA hit them. Hard, coordinated, professional. The enemy hadn't withdrawn. They'd simply shifted and were ready to keep fighting. Over 4 days, the battalion fought a vicious close-quarters battle just to hold Nai Ha. The NVA attacked repeatedly, mostly at night. The pattern became grimly predictable, probing attacks around midnight to locate American positions and automatic weapons. Then major assaults in the hours before dawn, when exhaustion ran deepest. Soldiers found themselves in hand-to-hand combat, fighting with rifle butts and entrenching tools when weapons jammed or ammunition ran out. One sergeant later described wrestling with an NVA soldier in a bomb crater. Both their rifles gone, knives and fists in near total darkness, while tracers streaked overhead. The battalion had to call in artillery danger close just to avoid being overrun. Rounds landing so near their own positions that concussions rattled teeth and showered them with dirt. Forward observers had to trust their calculations absolutely. A 50-meter error meant friendly fire casualties. This wasn't the support mission they'd been briefed on. This was survival, and nobody was coming to rescue them. They had to hold or die trying. By May 2nd, the normal boundaries of military life had dissolved completely. Marine units and Army units mixed together in fighting positions, sharing ammunition, sharing water, not bothering to ask about service patches or unit assignments. Draftees who'd been counting down days until they could go home fought alongside career NCOs on their 3rd voluntary tour. The 19-year-old from Iowa who'd never wanted to be there covered the 30-year-old Marine who'd signed up 3 times. Race stopped mattering in ways that would have seemed impossible back in the States. Black Marines and white Marines shared foxholes without a second thought, passed cigarettes, dragged each other to safety when someone got hit. The Confederate flag patches some wore in rear areas disappeared. The black power salutes others threw at base meant nothing out here. Fear was the great equalizer. So was exhaustion. When you hadn't slept in 2 days and couldn't remember your last hot meal, skin color didn't make the list of things worth thinking about. The farm boy from South Carolina and the factory worker from Detroit worried about the same things. Would they make it through the night? Would their families be taken care of if they didn't? Would the ammunition last until resupply? They learned each other's hometowns, girlfriends' names, what everyone planned to do when they got back to the world. These weren't friendships built on shared interests. They were survival partnerships, and they ran deeper than most peacetime relationships ever would. Shared misery built those bonds fast. The Marine who grew up in Montana found himself depending on a kid from the Bronx who'd never held a rifle before boot camp. The college-educated lieutenant relied on a high school dropout who'd enlisted to avoid jail, but turned out to be a natural leader. Competence mattered. Courage mattered. Nothing else did. If you could think clearly while rounds cracked overhead, you led, regardless of rank or time in service or anything written in your personnel file. May 3rd, after 72 hours of hell, the villages were finally in American hands. The last NVA resistance had been cleared or pushed back across the border. Marines and soldiers stood in what used to be Daido and the surrounding hamlets. Now it was just rubble, scorched earth, the smell of cordite and death. Battalion Landing Team. 2-4 had been gutted, over 80 killed, more than 250 wounded, nearly half their combat strength gone in 3 days. For what? A cluster of villages that didn't have a strategic port or airfield or anything else that seemed worth the cost. The 321 Infantry had taken heavy casualties at Niha. Medevac birds had been running nonstop, flying broken bodies back to field hospitals, while replacements who'd never seen combat tried to fill the gaps. Then came the order that made it all feel pointless. Abandon the positions. Pull back to Dong Ha. No permanent base. No long-term occupation. The ground they'd bled for would return to being contested territory. The NVA would filter back in within days. Everyone knew it, but nobody said it out loud because saying it made the sacrifice feel even more meaningless. For the men who'd fought through those days, the withdrawal hit different than a normal repositioning. They'd watch friends die taking specific buildings, specific tree lines, specific fucking mud walls. And now those positions didn't matter. Corpsmen had performed miracles keeping guys alive long enough to reach medevac, all so they could hold ground that was being abandoned without a fight. Private First Class Michael O'Brien had been the one to pull Sergeant Hayes out of that rice paddy on May 1st, dragging him 200 meters under fire while bullets kicked up water around them. Hayes survived. Lost his leg, but survived. O'Brien carried that memory like a badge of honor, until he found out they were abandoning the exact patch of ground he'd nearly died protecting. That's when it stopped making sense. Not the fighting, not the sacrifice. Those things had their own logic in the moment. But sacrificing for something that immediately disappeared, that was a different kind of pain, the kind that stuck. While Daido was grinding through companies, the world's attention was elsewhere. Hue had been the headline battle. Urban combat through an ancient city. Images of Marines fighting house to house. The kind of dramatic footage that filled news broadcasts. Quezon had captured imaginations. A prolonged siege that echoed Dien Bien Phu, the specter of another French disaster. Reporters camped there for weeks. The world watched and waited to see if the Marines would hold. Daido had none of that. No ancient city to fight through, no dramatic siege, just flat rice paddies and nameless villages that were destroyed and then abandoned. The kind of battle that didn't photograph well or tell a simple story. The official records were precise. 327 casualties for Battalion Landing Team. 2-4, 80 killed in action. The 321 Infantry added their own numbers. Enemy body counts claimed hundreds of NVA dead, though nobody could verify those figures. Awards were processed, after-action reports filed, and within weeks attention moved to the next crisis, That's how Vietnam worked. The machinery of war grinding forward, one nightmare replacing another without pause for reflection. The battle that should have stood alongside Hue and Khe Sanh got quietly filed away. Not forgotten by those who fought it, but forgotten by almost everyone else. The men who survived didn't need official recognition to remember. The weight stayed with them, the friends who didn't make it, the moments when survival hung by a thread, the strange mix of pride and grief that comes from walking out when so many others didn't. Years later, they'd gather at reunions, VFW halls, hotel conference rooms. Men who'd been 19 in 1968 now in their 60s and 70s, gray hair and reading glasses. But when they talked about Dai Do, something changed in their eyes. They'd name the friends who weren't there. Corporal Jenkins, who took shrapnel on May 1st, Lieutenant Morrison, who died leading a counterattack, Private Garcia, who'd been talking about his daughter the morning he got hit, keeping those names alive through repetition. They remembered sounds, the distinctive crack of AK-47 fire from multiple positions, that rapid staccato that meant you were in the kill zone, the whoosh of incoming mortars, the screams for corpsmen, the way your own heartbeat sounded in your ears when the firing stopped. They remembered carrying wounded across open ground. Every step an eternity. Knowing you were exposed but unable to leave him behind. The weight of a buddy in full gear, the slickness of blood on your hands, the desperate hope that a medevac could reach you in time. Some memories came easily. The sergeant who held together despite being wounded twice. The corpsman who worked on casualties with supplies running out. The private who somehow kept his squad moving when their leader fell. Other memories stayed locked away. The friend who called for his mother while dying. The decision to leave wounded behind when extraction became impossible. The moment of absolute certainty that you wouldn't survive the next 5 minutes. Those stories usually stayed buried, or came out only with others who'd been there. Families learned to recognize the signs, the faraway look that meant their father or husband was back in those paddies, the flinch at unexpected sounds, the reluctance to talk about what happened between April 30th and May 3rd, 1968. The villages returned to quiet. Rice paddies grew new crops. Tree lines sheltered nothing more dangerous than birds. The physical scars faded. But for those who fought there, Dai Do would never be just another forgotten operation. It was the place where they learned what they were made of, where they discovered the absolute limits of courage and the bottomless depths of sacrifice, where they became something different than what they'd been before, whether they wanted that transformation or not. The ground doesn't remember. Dirt and water don't hold memory. But the men do. They remember the heat that made vision blur, the crack of supersonic bullets, the thunder that lifted you off your feet, the jamming rifles and the captured weapons that saved lives, the artillery walking closer, the impossible decisions with no good answers. They remember the bonds forged in those 72 hours, friendships built on shared terror that outlasted marriages and careers. They remember what it cost to walk out alive, and they carry the names of those who didn't. As long as any of them remain, the Battle of Dai Do won't be completely forgotten. It'll live in hushed conversations between old warriors, in the silences that fall over reunion dinners, in the moments when a sound or smell triggers memories that never quite fade. That's not the kind of immortality that fills textbooks or documentary series. It's quieter than that, more personal, but it's the kind that matters to the men who were there. And maybe that's enough. The Magnificent Bastards, Battalion Landing Team, 2-4, April 30th to May 3rd, 1968. They walked into a trap meant for thousands with intelligence that said hundreds. They fought when their rifles failed them, led when their leaders fell, and held together when everything else fell apart. History may have filed them away quietly, but they were there. They fought, they bled, and some of them never came home. That's worth remembering. 5 ambushes, 5 battles that never made the history books. The men who fought in them didn't choose to be surprised. They just chose not to give up. That is not nothing. That is everything. Share this documentary, subscribe for a new one every week, and tell me in the comments, which of these 5 hit you hardest? I'll see you in the next one.